And as somebody who's dyspraxic myself, and also on the Education Select Committee, I have been very conscious that when we talk about how young people have been impacted by the disruption we've seen over the last year, the closure of schools, online learning, cancellation of exams, etc., that I've been very conscious of the particular impact that this could all have on young people with dyspraxia at school. And whenever I've been on the select committee, I've always tried to push that, sometimes feeling as though I'm sort of bashing my head against a brick wall, and how sometimes on the education committee there hasn't really been that many other members really mentioning that angle. And I mean, as somebody with dyspraxia and dyslexia, I certainly wouldn't have wanted to have been at school over the last year. I'm very glad that I'm not. I think I would have really been disadvantaged by the cancellation of exams, the move to online learning, and the challenges associated with that. So I'm very keen that we try and provide a voice to all of those young people who've struggled in that way, and try and give them the support they need as we look to recover, and to highlight that with government. So, I mean, hopefully that's today. We've got a number of different individuals who've got huge expertise in this area and experience of working with children, or being the parents of children with dyspraxia. And I think it should be very, very, it'll be very interesting to hear from them what it's been like, because I can only guess what it's been like, knowing how I found school, but I don't know for sure. So, and I certainly plan to take what I hear today and do what I can to air what I hear today, both in Parliament, with ministers, and on the Education Select Committee. So first, should I introduce Sophie? Sophie, to talk about school life during lockdown.
Yeah, so first and foremost, just to introduce myself, I am chair of the Dyspraxia Foundation, but I am going to talk today as a parent of a 16-year-old child currently in year 12 with dyspraxia. So this is purely based on our experience as a family. And then secondly, I will reference my experience currently working in an average size secondary school within Buckinghamshire. So firstly, for us as a family, my son was in year 11 when the first lockdown came about this time last year. And school's always been very difficult for him. When he started secondary school, he didn't even know his times tables. Reading age was okay, but really struggled with sport and with organisation and many traits that children with dyspraxia have. The biggest surprise to me that came when we had the shock announcement that we were going into lockdown was how bereft my son felt that school life was coming to an end. I thought that he would be overjoyed and would be happy, and there would be a sense of relief. But actually it highlighted how important routine is to him, and having that structure and that scaffolding around it was really stark that he really struggled to know what to do with himself, because we didn't know what was going to be happening with the exams, with GCSEs. There was very little input from school. We didn't have any welfare calls, not certainly for the first month or so. There was no direction from class teachers to say, keep up with your revision, or perhaps you might like to have a go at this, with any deadlines. Literally, it was the lack of structure. So for us as a family, we have a younger sibling as well, at primary school, juggling school life. I was working in the school myself at the time. My son was quite often left all day, all alone to his own devices. And you can imagine, as a teenager, not particularly healthy, stuck in his room. Contact with peers was limited, so that peer support as well, I think, has greatly impacted on mental health. And then, as obviously we had the exams or teachers assessed grades, how that unfolded. It was a really worrying time for him. And thankfully, he had worked really hard all his time at school. And I think that's quite a trait of many children with dyspraxia, that they do have that tenacity, and they will absolutely do their best all the time. And I was very lucky that we had subject teachers at my son's secondary school that understood the condition and were able to see that maybe in some cases where, handwriting is it was illegible really, but they did have evidence, so that they were able to submit that and assess and grade, and thankfully he did get his GCSEs. But the stress and the leading up to that probably took its toll. And actually from September, with starting college, the impact of being at college as a virtual learner has been a disaster. You're on a call with potentially 90 other students and unable to have the time to ask questions or to even keep up with the lecturer or the teacher, maybe if in a sixth form setting. So that's put a huge amount of pressure on us as a family. We have had support from tutors at college so that we've been able to go over the work again, but that has meant that most evenings or weekends, myself and my husband have had to support my son with his learning. And thankfully, he's studying a BTEC in IT, a level 3, and he's just lucky that he's got two parents who have had that experience in industry, and a father who has that knowledge. Had it been in any other subject, he would have failed his course this year. That's just one story, and I'm sure there are, for some children it may be a blessing, and I do have examples of that from a school setting. And I have spoken to many parents. I business partner with a head teacher, and I also head up communication, so I'm not teaching staff. But the feedback that I've received from my parents is, although there has been many frustrations around being stuck at home, there have been some advantages in our school setting. We have we're overstaffed with LSAs, and that's worked to our advantage because that's enabled them to have daily contact with our children that are on the SEN register. So that's not even with children who have an EHCP. And that's mean they've been able to look at the pre-learning and set up the learning and actually giving them a modified curriculum so they could concentrate solely on the core subjects, being English, maths and science. Then they're able on a daily basis to check in on the learning and support the student alongside welfare calls to the family. So the family have felt fully supported, and we're able to listen to the concerns and address those on a daily basis. But I would suggest that that is very rare, and certainly knowing that we're in a smaller than average secondary school with a huge amount of LSAs. Again, from virtual learning, teachers have said it's been very difficult because it's usually potentially you'd be a child with dyspraxia or coexisting conditions. They would have them at the front of the class with them to check in on them, to up the understanding of the learning, and they would also have the peer support, and that peer support has been hugely lacking. As I mentioned, the advantages to the modified curriculum, but then there could have been the disadvantages also of the extracurricular. So for many children with dyspraxia, the extracurricular could be, for instance, drum lessons, or having that time in their own time, maybe to do horse riding lessons or to play golf. And as we know, many of our children with dyspraxia really thrive in these sports rather than taking part in team sports. And of course, they've been taken off the agenda, and that has had an impact on their well-being and their mental health as their outlet. What's really key for me actually as a parent, and I don't, I'm sure we will have other parents who will give evidence at future evidence, as well as our young people, is that the recovery curriculum, I think, has to address the wider issue of the curriculum for children with dyspraxia and SEN. And actually maybe we need to take it back to the drawing board and look at actually where the failings have been within education prior to this pandemic, and actually take some of the positives of the learning. So perhaps something like the modified curriculum. It may not be right that children are pushed to have to take a language, or to look at those core skills, and I'm sure people will have views on that. And also perhaps we do have them back in the classroom now, but maybe there should be some form of national assessment. And I think as a parent, I wouldn't want my child to know that they're going through yet another assessment, but I would like to know where my son is and in line with a national average. And I don't think that should be placed on an individual school. I would like to see that personally as a national scheme. And then the risk assessment around the harm to their well-being and their mental health, and as well their harm to education, so that there isn't the damage to their life chances.
Well, thanks a lot for that, Sophie. I'm going to bring in Emma, but I do think that on this we've got this issue with the special needs review, the SEND review, which has been much delayed, and I think this is unfortunate. But hopefully, one of the benefits of it being delayed is that when it is finally done, it can properly take into account the impact of the last year on pupils. And it can take that into account, and part of that needs to be assessing loss, the loss that there's been. So Emma.
Hi, thanks Tom. Hi everyone, my name's Emma Llewellyn-Buck. I'm the joint chair of the APPG along with Tom. Sorry, I've only just managed to get logged on in the middle of Sophie's piece there, so if that's all right with everyone, I'll let Tom continue to do a sterling job of chairing, and I just wanted to say hello, and I'll be here for the duration, IT permitting. Okay, thanks.
And so I think if we I think we're going to talk to Dr. Sally Payne now, but I think I mean there's going to be time for questions and a bit of a debate, but I'm very keen to hear from Michelle at some point, who I've spoken to quite a lot about these issues and who I think will have a lot of interesting insights. But I'll just pass on to Dr. Sally Payne.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you. So thank you for the invitation to speak this afternoon. I'm just going to share my screen here, hopefully find the right screen to share with you before we get started. Okay, so I'm Sally Payne. I'm an occupational therapist, trustee of the Dyspraxia Foundation and chair of the medical and research panels. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak this afternoon. The information that I'm presenting represents the very much preliminary findings from an online survey carried out by the Dyspraxia Foundation in March 2021. Respondents to the survey were parents and carers of dyspraxic children and young people living in the UK, and the findings reflect their perceptions of the impact of multiple lockdowns on dyspraxic children's education and development. As we know, dyspraxia is a developmental disorder that primarily affects motor coordination, including large body movements such as balance and posture, and the fine motor skills that enable us to grip and handle objects such as a pencil and cutlery. Dyspraxia can also affect speech and executive functions such as memory, attention, time management, and organisational skills. These motor and non-motor difficulties affect all aspects of a person's life at home, at school, and during their leisure time, as Sophie has mentioned earlier. Research before the pandemic indicated that young people with dyspraxia, or developmental coordination disorder as it's also known, are at greater risk of educational underachievement, mental health difficulties, particularly anxiety and depression, poorer physical health and fitness, and lower health-related quality of life. And it's right, therefore, that we take this opportunity now to consider the additional impact that multiple lockdowns has had on the educational experience of children and young people with dyspraxia, recognising, of course, that the influence that education has on people's employment opportunities, their income, health and well-being across the lifespan. The Dyspraxia Foundation survey examined parents' retrospective perspectives on their child's experience of home learning, of returning to school, and the impact of lockdown on their child's personal and academic development. We had over 200 respondents to the survey, 85% of whom were living in England. 52% were parents or carers of young people of secondary school age, and 46% were of primary school age. More boys than girls were represented, reflecting our understanding that boys are more likely to have dyspraxia than girls, and that girls are typically diagnosed later. Most children attended a mainstream school, and only 22% had an education, health and care plan. Before I move on to present the findings, I think we just need to acknowledge some limitations of this study. It was, of course, an online survey, so people without access to technology who may experience other disadvantages and inequalities were excluded from participating. Respondents were also self-selecting, so responses may not be representative of the views and experiences of all parents and dyspraxic children. And the survey was also retrospective, so responses may have been influenced by people's subsequent experiences. That said, analysis does, however, highlight some useful learning points, we feel. As has been demonstrated by other studies, time spent on formal home learning was greater during the third lockdown than the first lockdown, as online teaching became more organised and structured. There were, however, big differences in children's individual experiences, which is a theme that continues throughout these findings. Most, but not all schools provided some work during the first lockdown. However, half did not provide work that was differentiated for an individual's child's needs, and this improved only slightly during the third lockdown. Many dyspraxic students, as we know, benefit from access to alternative tools and resources to support their learning, such as specialist software, books, and different tools, scissors and pencils. But half of the schools didn't make these available to students during the first lockdown, with only some improvement during the third. More parents described communication from school as good or very good during the third lockdown compared to the first, but around 50% of respondents described communication about their child's learning and support needs as poor or very poor during both time periods. Similarly, while children who received additional learning support prior to the first lockdown were more likely to receive this in the third lockdown compared to the first, many children didn't receive the individual or small group support that they had been assessed as requiring for their education and development. Parents were expected to differentiate work and provide one-to-one support at home, whilst also managing their own work and home commitments. Dyspraxic children often benefit from input from health professionals such as occupational therapy, speech and language therapy, and physiotherapy. However, therapy support almost disappeared for many children during the first lockdown, with many children still not able to access vital interventions almost 12 months on. This reflects the findings of the Disabled Children's Partnership Left in Lockdown report, which was published in June 2020. Dyspraxic children have therefore lost the opportunity to learn essential skills impacting on their educational attainment, social participation, independence and well-being. Others have not been able to access a diagnostic assessment, making it difficult for parents and teachers to identify strategies and interventions to support their learning and development over this critical time period. In our survey, parents were asked to rate how worried they are about the impact of lockdown on their child's learning, development and well-being. Parents were most worried about the impact on their child's confidence, social skills and mental health. The global picture, however, doesn't tell the whole story. Some children, as we know, benefited from home learning, particularly those who've struggled with the pace and busyness of a typical classroom. One parent said, Before lockdown, my child was suffering as a result of being in school without any additional support. His academic and social skills were affected and his mental health was poor. The first lockdown was more beneficial to him as he was able to regroup and, with a lot of support from me, pick up with the academic skills and gaps in learning that were present and progress at his own pace rather than in the short periods allocated when in a class of 30 children. Some dyspraxic children, however, really struggled without the routine and support that school provided, as Sophie illustrated earlier. A parent told us, "We saw a big deterioration in behaviour, which triggered worsening relationships with us, his parents. And though we did try to keep things positive, the stress of managing our son's anxieties with trying to work from home and meeting our other child's needs meant it was hard to summon the patience to respond to negative behaviour in the most constructive ways at all times. We saw a big rise in negative self-talk in our son." Concerns about the impact of multiple lockdowns on dyspraxic children's mental health was a common theme. Some parents had sought specialist help, and many, although not all, were able to access this, but often from non-NHS services, and many paid privately. We should be concerned, I think, about families who don't have the resources to access this type of help. In this next section, I'm going to focus on dyspraxic children's experience of returning to school. Parents had mixed opinions of the support that was provided, but again, it's helpful to look at individual experiences as well as the overall themes. Parents described some really good practice, and I think Sophie gave us a good illustration of good practice earlier. One parent said, "The school arranged for the children moving from the infant site to the junior site to attend a settling in day in a small group if they wanted. They also made videos showing the other site, the new classroom, etc., which helped us to discuss the changes with our son." Other children, however, suffered from limited preparation and poor handover of information from one teacher to the next, meaning that children were left to fend for themselves in an already really stressful situation. The next few slides include quotes illustrating the unintended consequences for dyspraxic children of changes made by schools to keep pupils safe. It's worth noting again that some of the changes were positive and improved the school experience for dyspraxic children. I think it's really important that we capture this learning so that we can amplify it as we move forward. Social distancing measures meant that some dyspraxic children were separated from their peers, the peers that they rely on for friendship and support, heightening their sense of loneliness and isolation. Some dyspraxic children also missed the natural movement breaks between lessons, which helped them focus and attend. Other children, however, were less tired because restrictions on movement around the school meant they didn't have to walk so far. It's a very different picture for different individuals. Several parents told us that dyspraxic children preferred eating a packed lunch in class because they find the noise and bustle of the dining hall very stressful. However, restricted access to spaces at break times and lunch times meant that there wasn't always somewhere for children to go for a bit of quiet time, which many need for a cognitive reset in the middle of the school day. The suspension of out-of-school clubs has been particularly difficult for many dyspraxic children who benefit from the opportunities that these provide, particularly to develop friendship groups and social skills. On the other hand, changes to PE lessons were often identified as an unintended benefit for dyspraxic children. Going to school wearing PE kit, for example, meant children didn't have the stress of getting changed quickly and were less likely to lose items of clothing, which was a relief both to them and their parents. Like many students, dyspraxic children had experienced disruptions due to school closures and isolation during the autumn term. This is particularly challenging for dyspraxic students who need consistent routines to allow them to focus on organising themselves, their equipment and their learning. Changes to learning support also affected children's access to the curriculum. Classroom assistants were not always available to ensure that dyspraxic students had the right equipment and understood the learning task, meaning that they didn't always complete the work as intended. This has significant consequences for a young person's academic attainment over the coming years. So what can we learn from the findings of this survey? Firstly, and most significantly, it's really important to look beyond the numbers, because if you looked at the numbers, the average often doesn't portray the full story. Some children have thrived whilst learning at home, while others have really struggled. Similarly, some children have benefited from changes such as smaller classes, while changes to school routines have disrupted others' learning. It's really important that we look at each young person as an individual to identify the adjustments and supports that they need for their learning, for their development and their mental health as we move forward. We need to continue to raise awareness of dyspraxia in schools. Parents said that home learning has opened their eyes to the difficulties that their children experience, especially their non-motor difficulties, difficulties with organisation, planning, attention and time management. We need to continue to raise awareness that difficulties associated with dyspraxia are not just physical. Thirdly, experience during the pandemic has again highlighted the importance of good communication between home and school to ensure that strategies that work well are replicated in all settings and to prevent difficulties from escalating. And finally, there needs to be better collaboration between education and health services to ensure that dyspraxic children can access the diagnostic and therapy support that they need and deserve. On a practical level, the experience of lockdown has enabled parents and carers to identify many factors that support their child's learning, their development and their well-being, including these: the importance of structure, routine and frequent movement breaks, that dyspraxic children need more time to process information and instructions than their peers. Telling them to hurry up is counterproductive. The importance of getting outside and prioritising time to take part in leisure activities for general health and well-being. The value of teaching touch typing, an important life skill. Parents have learned that supporting children to master life skills such as making a snack and tying shoelaces can really help children's self-esteem, especially when they are less confident in other areas of life. Parents have also learned the importance of supporting their children to develop and maintain social connections, whether that's in person or virtually. And most importantly of all, they have identified the need to listen to the child's voice to find out what really matters to them. Now, we're really aware that this survey has only explored parents' and carers' views on dyspraxic children's experience of multiple lockdowns, so there is a gap in the story that I've presented today. I will finish, however, with one final quote from a member of the Dyspraxia youth group who reflected on what she has learned about herself over the past 12 months. I've learned that I'm more resilient than I think, and I've maybe become more determined to do my best. Online lectures have positively challenged me and allowed me to become more confident on camera. I perhaps wouldn't have had the chance to develop my self-confidence in this way in normal times. So there you go. That's the findings, as I say, very preliminary findings from the survey that we carried out very recently.
Thank you very much, Sally. It has been very, very helpful. And I'd actually be really interested to get those slides via email. It'd be very useful to have those at my fingertips so I can share some of those statistics with colleagues. So we're going to sort of open it up now for a sort of questions to a panel, but also a general debate. I was just wondering if Michelle, you might be interested in sharing your views. Michelle is actually the head teacher at a school purely for dyslexic pupils, but also has a strong understanding of dyspraxic pupils as well. So, and I've spoken to her before many of my meetings to try and give me help me, give me a bit of an insight into how things have been. So, Michelle, I was wondering if you could say a few words.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, so
at my school, all the children are dyslexic, but we also have a very high number of pupils that are dyspraxic and dyscalculic as well. About 50% of the pupils at my school have an EHCP. And during the first lockdown and even the second and third lockdown, we taught all lessons online, live, which in some ways is wonderful and sort of backs up what Sally's saying. For some pupils, that really works. For some pupils, it doesn't work. They need to be in the classroom, they need to see the teacher. And we tried to do our best, and it was really successful, and the parent feedback was fantastic. We listened to our parents when things weren't working. We changed the way that we were doing things. So instead of expecting our pupils just to sit live on a Zoom or a Teams call for the whole time, we incorporated movement breaks into the lessons just to get them up and moving, get a drink. And that really benefited our dyspraxic pupils. But I wouldn't sort of claim to say that it was all perfect. Some of my dyspraxic learners, in fact, one boy in my Year 11 biology group, started off really, really well, but as time progressed, found it more and more difficult. And the aspects that he found really difficult were the organisational side of things. The assignments were starting to build up. Mum and Dad were working, much like sort of Sophie explained as well. And Mum was struggling to try and support him. And the more that she was trying to support and get him on top of all the tasks, the more anxiety that was causing for him. And it's quite funny, actually. Well, not funny, but I was on a training course today about mental health awareness and resilience, so that the timing's quite apt with all this. And that's one of the areas that I'm really concerned about for our pupils. With SEN is the impact on their mental health, not just now, but long term, because I don't think we're going to see a lot of the mental health impact for quite a while. So that's an area that really interests me, and something that we work really hard at our school to try and help support the pupils with. But it's been tough. I don't think anybody could say otherwise. It's been good in some ways, but it's been tough. And now as a teacher, what I feel is that we're cramming the syllabus into a very short space of time. So although we've been teaching live lessons and we've been trying to keep up with the curriculum, now's when the real teaching actually begins, when we see the pupils in person. And I think Sally mentioned about the OT therapy as well. Just very quickly, that's really difficult to deliver over a Zoom call or over a Teams call. And speaking, we've got in-house therapists at our school. So I've got 2 occupational therapists, and they've sort of spoken to me about how you need to see the pupil, how they're sitting, how they're moving their body and different things, and how they manipulate the equipment. So it's been really, our pupils are already disadvantaged when it comes to academics and exams, and now unfortunately they're even more so compared to their peers, and that attainment gap, I'm very aware of it, and although we try and mitigate it as much as we possibly can, it is getting wider for SEN pupils and general population of pupils, unfortunately.
Sorry, I pressed something wrong there. That's very interesting to hear, and it's it's interesting thinking about the exams point as well, because I had extra time at exams, and I think as most, I think probably most dyspraxic pupils do get extra time, but I have to say I always preferred exams, and I liked exams, and I often felt that because as being dyspraxic, we're not conventional learners, we learn things in our own way, and I often did better in exams than many teachers were expecting. So I was sort of wondering what your views are about the situation with assessment, and how you think perhaps dyspraxic pupils may have been disadvantaged potentially by, I know no one child's the same, and there'll be plenty of dyspraxic pupils who don't like exams, but many, including myself, quite like them, and it kind of gave us the opportunity to consolidate our knowledge in my own weird way.
Yeah. And that's one of those things we sort of loosely and maybe informally refer to them as the maverick learners, where they sort of pull it out the bag at the last minute. It's quite typical of boys in schools as well, to sort of have that last push around about the Easter holidays, where they can cram and retain information, and they often do far better in exams. So if we look at the current situation where the teachers are doing centre assessed grades, and we're responsible for predicting what are we basing those predictions on? Because if we're basing those predictions on the last lockdown, then yes, our pupils are not going to fare very well. So we've got to take a very much more of a holistic view. We're doing some assessments in school. We're trying to gather as much evidence as possible, but it disadvantages our pupils because they have struggled with online learning, no matter how good the provision is. And if that's the evidence that we have to use, then it doesn't give those pupils the opportunity to shine in an exam like they would have done in previous years.
And I think that's a really, really key point that leads into the well-being and the mental health, because that's my experience as a parent, that my son was building. You could see the build towards those GCSEs, and that's where the loss came, and that's where the impact has been on the mental health. And I don't know how he will recover from that.
And I agree that the dyspraxic pupil in my biology lesson, he was probably on target for a grade 7 in his GCSE, maybe even an 8 on a good day with a good paper. He's struggling. He's become disengaged, and that's sort of typical of a lot of my year 11 pupils at the moment. They're so disengaged with education. They're sort of almost writing off this year and looking towards college. And I'm trying to keep them motivated and saying that we really need this evidence. We want you to get a good grade. But when a pupil is so low and has become that despondent, it's very difficult to pick them up and to help them to believe in themselves again.
So I was wondering, so we're open to all sort of contributions now. So I think if you, I've known on Teams, the hand raising seems to work quite well, but I don't know what the hand raising facility is here. So maybe if we just put into the chat, you'd like to talk, and then we'll,
raise hand appears to be working. I can see that someone raised their hand.
Well, I don't really need to raise my. So I just say, well, Emma wants to say something. Emma.
Hi everyone again. I've eventually settled and properly logged on now. Thanks for that, Sophie and Sally. And I was just wondering, obviously, you know, this session is around part of our inquiry into trying to gather some information before the summer to feed into any of the DFE's plans around, you know, catch up and how children with dyspraxia don't get lost in that. So I suppose my question to the panel is, you know, what does catch up look like over the summer for children with dyspraxia?
I think that's a really good question, and the couple of things the couple of things that occur to me. Yes, there's the academic catch-up, but actually it's more about the other things for dyspraxic children in particular, I would suggest. And the bits that Sophie talked about, the social, the opportunities for social interaction, those clubs and outdoor extracurricular activities that have been missing are so important to dyspraxic children that maybe don't fit in with other activities that children of their age are getting into. So for me, catching up would be the opportunity for social engagement to participate in activities at which they can be successful. Catch up would also include access to therapies. And I know that that's tricky because we're talking about education and health working together, but that's critical for this particular population who are struggling maybe with the movements, with the language. Catch up isn't just about education, it's about mental health well-being, which I think schools and education have focused on reasonably well at a universal level. I think that came through in the research that parents were saying schools had doing some support around well-being. There are some sick children that need that specialist support from CAMS services and what have you, which may be difficult to access, but it's wider than that. It's about the physical therapies as well.
Okay,
Just out of interest, do we know what percentage of roughly of young people with dyspraxia have got an EHCP plan? I was just wondering.
We don't, but 22% of respondents in this survey had it, which it feels about right. Many dyspraxic children don't reach the threshold for an EHCP and are supported at the SEN support level.
That's been one of my...
Sorry, Tom. I was just wondering if Sophie had wanted to come in.
I did.
Yeah.
It was just around, I totally agree with everything that Sally's saying, and I think that what I would call that extracurricular is really crucial. In terms of maybe what can be done within a school setting, and this is my point where maybe this has always been a gap potentially in mainstream, is having those smaller intervention groups. And I think it's really crucial that we talk to our young people with a positive voice, that we're not using language of catch up or behind, that we look at building on, consolidating, because they already know they're not stupid and it doesn't help anybody. And I think that's really crucial in the build up to getting them ready to be successful from September.
So Sophie, would that mean like, are you advocating there that schools actually run classes throughout the summer? Is that?
I mean, it depends on the area. I think again, this is very difficult. But my school, we have a very high proportion of pupil premium, so we would be looking to ensure that we did have some sort of summer school provision, because again, those children have lost out on huge amounts, and so not just our SEN children. And I don't want to divert, but I would say that would vary greatly from provision to provision, and I think that should be left to an individual school's choice. But certainly, as for us as a school, it's really important that yes, that we give them that mixed experience. So it wouldn't all be about the academics; it would be the things that Sally is also talking about. It might even be a trip to a museum, you know, things that just be with their peers again and have that time. I think it's crucial.
That's really great. Thank you both. I'll not hog the time anymore, Tom. I'll let others come in. But can I just quickly ask, is anyone camera shy? Is it okay if my office take a quick photo of what all just to share on social media? Is that okay? If you don't want to be on a photo, please let us know. Okay. Thanks, Tom. I'll hand back over to you, Chair.
It's just it is a bit of a concern, you know, when you've got, because it's so. I mean, I think the concern is that, I mean, when we're thinking about, you know, those with SEND and when the government's approaching it as well, that the focus is very much on those with EHCP plans, and you know, if it is a case, you know, that survey, it's just a sample, but it's a decent sample, and you know, 78% of those with dyspraxia don't have one of those plans. And I have to say, I mean, I've raised questions in the chamber before over the last few months to government ministers about you know, dyspraxic and dyslexic pupils, and the responses I've got have really been, haven't seemed to have understood the fact that it's important that yes, we're thinking about those with the plans, but also those without. And my concern is that if we're not careful, you know, it's going to be dyslexic and dyspraxic pupils who don't have an EHC plan who could fall through a net when it comes to, you know, I have heard that in order for the catch up, the tutors for catch up, and the government have said that they've had, you know, those specialisms feeding into that, but I just don't know whether that would be sufficient or not. Okay, has anyone else got any?
I'd just like to add, I don't think it will be sufficient, because those pupils, I would say, pre-COVID have already fallen between the gap.
Because I actually asked a question in the comments, and I said, well, you know, what's going to be, what is the government going to do to try and make sure that during the third lockdown, dyslexic and dyspraxic pupils don't fall further behind? And the response was, well, children with an EHC plan can still go in, you know, and that was the response. And I thought, okay, great, that's the level of sophistication that is being approached with it.
Just while we've got a second, Gavin has his hand up. I don't know whether you wanted to speak, Gavin. Hang on, you're on mute.
Yeah. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm the coordinator for Dyspraxia at Lambeth, and I'm also autistic dyspraxic, and I'm dyslexic. I'm an academic at London South Bank University, so my interest is in transition of youth into the world of work, and that's currently what I'm currently looking at. And under the European Convention of the Rights of the Child, children's needs are currently not being met by the government, as been highlighted by you know, Sally's presentation and others here today. And so what we are trying to do in education is prepare the child for the future. And in FE and HE, I come across quite a lot of children who are neurodiverse, who are not prepared for the future, who are not resilient, who are not able to cope, or not able to function in that space. And then employers are having to play catch up 6 months into their training and just trying to teach them functional skills and soft skills in the workplace. And that's the result of people falling through the gap who haven't got plans, who haven't got support or SEN. And a large proportion of my evidence that in my research has just demonstrated a lot of these children end up in prison, or they end up in homelessness, of which are all sector, which are also working. And so these, I can't overestimate or in my evidence and my research just how important it is for all students to get a developmental pathway and to get a support both on an advocacy level and also SEN level early on in their school careers, and that transition through to secondary and then into to HE. Far too many students are only getting a diagnosis when they go into university, rather than from the ages early years into HE. And this is a long-term knock-on effect. If a person doesn't get a diagnosis, the likelihood that it's going to cost the state or the local council is about 60 to 80,000 pounds per year in extra services per person if they end up with multiple complex challenges, which they often do, and who end up with a long-term mental health and physical challenges. So I can't underestimate, it's not just about a dyspraxic situation, it's really about the long-term prospects. And so what you're doing, Tom, is really important to kind of highlight the fact that we need not just a short-term interim transition, but we need a long-term developmental pathway. So that's all from me.
I think it would be. I think before we. So I mean, we're down for this meeting to end at 5:30. So I'd like to, if there's any more questions, but also I think if before we finish, we begin to maybe take sort of some takeaways, some key themes about just thinking about dyspraxic people at school and the 3 key ways in which we think they've been impacted. I mean, I know there's some good stuff that we've heard about how they've coped well, which is good, and that's important that we learn that. But I think just in terms of, I think if we think like, I'm already beginning to think like the disruption element and the importance of routine and structure for dyspraxic pupils and the way that's kind of been disrupted, the way in which many have struggled with online learning or and the lack of engagement through not having that kind of one-to-one support, and potentially the assessment issue as well. So I'm just beginning to I'm in a mental health angle. So just trying to begin, if we can sort of think that 5:30 is when we're finishing, and maybe if we can try and have a bit of a think about what we think the takeaways are. Emma?
Yeah, thanks for that, Tom. Just to come in as well, I think it's important to remember, I've had a lot of parents contact me to say that their children with dyspraxia haven't been able to go back to school. There seems to be a trend in some schools saying that because of the COVID requirements, they can't give dyspraxic children or children with SEND the attention they need and the support they need. So they've actually off-rolled them, which is a problem we've seen repeatedly over previous years. But I think coronavirus has gave them that excuse to off-roll children a lot more. So I think it's about how we make sure that those children actually get back into school as well.
That's very worrying, very worrying.
And very key to look at school refusers as well. That's definitely, I would say, greatly increased since COVID. And attendance in general, I think not only looking at the children with dyspraxia or SEND, that many parents are also struggling, and then again we have issues around attendance, and that will affect life chances ultimately.
And I think for me, the recognition that dyspraxia is not just a physical difficulty. That I think that's not really well understood. So if teachers may have, I think we all do, don't we? You have your perception of what a condition is, and I think we need to change that. I think what's become really apparent is that when children have been at home having to organise their own learning, that's really tricky, and they've really relied, as you alluded to earlier, Tom, that relying on routine, structure, and somebody to make sure that they've understood what the lesson is about. When that's taken away from them, that's been that's really impacted on their learning. So getting the message out that actually we don't just need to think about the physical adjustments when we're thinking about dyspraxic students, we need to think about more widely about the supports that they need.
Yeah, definitely. I've really only been impacted by it in terms of, I haven't really been that. Other than the fact that I couldn't do my shoelaces until I was about 15, couldn't do my tie until I was about 20. Apart from that, for me, it hasn't been so. Hasn't been that way. And and I think that and Emma's probably found it as well. Like being an MP and being a dyspraxic MP. It's been. One of the things that I've done is I've probably been coming into the estate, the parliamentary estate, far more than most other MPs, because I found that, and fortunately the speaker here gave me a special exemption to allow me to have one member of staff in with me, so that helped me because I struggle doing certain stuff online, and I need structure, routine, and having somebody to support me in the office. I thought has been so. Fortunately, I've been able to come into my workplace. I've been able to have somebody here to support me, and it's been all right. But
John has raised his hand if we've got a minute to take questions. Oh, not John, sorry, Michelle.
Yes, hi, sorry. I just wanted to raise the point that a lot of my parents have reported that their children's physical fitness have gone down. I'm a physio, so it's kind of my thing, but also that obesity and putting on weight, especially in the teenagers, has been quite a worrying thing for the parents.
That being a particular, is that an issue for all young people though, or particularly for dyspraxic, do you think?
Probably for all, but I think certainly it's been more highlighted, and the parents have said more so for their children. They're noticing the rest of the class who've kind of gone off and done things in the garden, perhaps, but they have been more sort of physically not moving around as much.
And I agree with Michelle, children with dyspraxia are at greater risk of reduced physical fitness anyway. So then having limited opportunities, I think, will really have impacted them over this period of time.
And we also know that they are 4 times more likely to be obese anyway. So I think that this is an issue as well. And we need to think about their general health as well.
Okay, have we got any more points? Well, I think that's it. I think that's been a very valuable session, and and I hope it's given everyone I think we've been very fortunate to have Sophie and Sally as speakers today, and for everybody else for chipping in. And I know it certainly helped shape my thinking, and I'm sure it's helped shape Emma's thinking as well. And I think that we're both very passionate about trying to advocate in Parliament for those with dyspraxia, and it's never been more important to do that because of the different unique ways in which dyspraxic peoples may have been impacted by what we've seen over the last year or so. And just picking up on something that Sophie said about the language we use, catch up, lost generation, this sort of stuff. I couldn't agree more. I think there is a big challenge. There's no doubt about that. And we can't hide that, but I do think we're dealing with young people who are already highly anxious about what's happened over the last year and what it means for their future. They're not idiots, they know that, and I think we just need to be careful with the language we use. And I think lost generation, out of all the phrases I've heard, is probably very acutely conscious of the position that they're in, and I think it's going to be hard, but we need to have some positivity there as well. And I think particularly for dyspraxic young people who are challenging, but are also very creative and are able to achieve great things. And there's no reason why they can't do that despite the pandemic. Is that it? Is that do I leave now? Do I leave the meeting?
So.
There
was some great.
That's it.
Be an ending.
Okay.
Thank you everyone for comments in the chat. They've been fantastic reading through. There's lots of discussion going on about all the points that we've raised. So I just wanted to bring those to light just before we finished.
And
Brilliant.
thank you from me as well, and my sincere apologies for not being able to join you at the outset.
Okay. All right. See you.
Can I just check on the AGM part, or are we going to rearrange that?
Well,
I'm
yeah,
gonna-
we'll have to.
Yeah.
We'll have to rearrange. Sorry. Yeah,
I'm
there was
gonna
a few. There was a few. We need 5 MPs or PRs, and a lot of them seem to have the same link that I had, where it was just not letting me in. So
Always happens
Okay.
to us.